Hi there. So the topic of this video is pretty serious. Just maybe prepare yourself for that. But let's get into it. With the current landscape of our politics, issues surrounding the queer community are talked about quite frequently, often in a less than empathetic way. The concerns of the queer community are being pushed aside, especially those of trans people. You see, the unfortunate thing about our government is that it's run by a bunch of old men who are scared of things they don't understand. And those who follow them are also scared of things they don't understand. And that fear turns into hate, which spreads online and creates a lot of animosity between people who agree and disagree with whatever hateful thing was said. Something that I've noticed about a lot of homophobic and transphobic arguments that I see online and in the news is that they're incredibly ill-informed. Now, this isn't surprising, but it is concerning. A lot of people spouting off this misinformed rhetoric are those in important positions or positions of power, and they just spout off the same false nonsense, and they use that false nonsense to justify their hateful actions and agendas. One argument that I often heard when I was younger, and even sometimes still now, is that all these issues surrounding trans and queer people are new. We've never had to deal with issues like trans rights, and kids didn't used to be gay. It's a new thing that we've never seen before. Obviously, we don't know how to deal with it. The unfortunate thing about this is that it's just untrue. The concept of being queer and the concept of being trans, for that matter, are not new concepts. These go really far back. There's proof of it everywhere in the media. Nothing brings this to my mind more than the documentary The Queen and especially Paris is Burning. These are both documentaries that are actually quite similar. The Queen is a documentary focusing on the Miss All-American Camp Beauty pageant and gives us a great insight into the world of drag queens and their pageants. Paris is Burning is also a documentary. Like The Queen, it focuses on queer culture and drag queens, but it more heavily focuses on what it is to be black and queer. I recently watched both these films, and I gotta say, they recontextualized history for me. I admit that for a long time I was also of the mind that a lot of queer issues were very recent, and I think this is not only a failure of American education, but also a failure of media to represent the queer community and their history. These films, and especially their ages, shocked me to my core. Previously, I had been under the impression that queer issues and the emergence of queer culture had become significant maybe in the early 2000s, late 90s at the very earliest. I definitely learned throughout my teenage years that it was much earlier than that, but I still underestimated just how long the queer community has been out and proud. In fact, the queer community was going pretty damn strong for a long time. Paris is Burning is about ball culture in the 1980s and was released in 1991. The Queen was released in 1968 and documented a beauty pageant in 1967. The 60s. The 1960s. If you told a Republican that gay people were out and proud in the 60s, I think they would have a heart attack. Hell, in Paris is Burning, Pepper LaBeija is able to completely lay out the history of ball culture from the 60s through the 80s.
When I first started going to balls, it was all about drag queens, and they were interested in looking like Las Vegas showgirls. Back pieces, tail pieces, feathers, beads, and all that. But as the 70s rolled around, the things started changing. It started coming down to just wanting to look like a gorgeous movie star like Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor. And now they went from that to trying to look like models like Iman and Christy Brinkley and Maud Adams and all those children.
The thing that I find most shocking is that this stuff isn't exactly hidden. You can go watch Paris is Burning with an HBO Max subscription literally right now. In fact, you should do that. You should go do that right now. I mean, finish this first, but then go do that. It's not that hard to gain access to these two films, let alone the hundreds of other films that exist to prove that the queer community has always been here. Yet, that being said, people don't know about them. Even I, a young queer person, didn't know my own history. Although that being said, I also didn't know about my queerness for a while, so why is it? Why is it that I don't know my own history? Why is it that others don't know my history? Well, it's the same reason why anybody doesn't know their history. It was forgotten. But why? Where are all those queens from the balls? Where are the house mothers and fathers? Why haven't more of them told their story? Well, the unfortunate truth is that none of them are alive to tell their stories. Where are they? They're all dead.
A mystery disease known as the gay plague has become an epidemic unprecedented in the history of American medicine.
The AIDS epidemic isn't something to joke about, and it certainly isn't something insignificant. It wasn't an unfortunate loss or the fault of those who had it. The AIDS epidemic was a tragedy of poor judgment and government neglect that led to the death of around 40 million people worldwide in barely a decade. 40 million people. So many of those deaths were queer people. HIV and AIDS is spread through sex and bodily fluids. A number of AIDS victims were queer. The reasons for this are many, but HIV and AIDS was undoubtedly considered a gay disease. There were many who believed that AIDS was a response by God to cleanse the gay population. In reality, God had nothing to do with it. But have no doubt, the AIDS epidemic was an attempt to kill the queer population. It wasn't God or some higher power. It was those in power who hated queer people for who they were and wanted them all dead. And guess what? It worked. Think about it. Why can it be so hard to find an older queer person? Because this disease came out of the woodwork and the government did nothing about it. Didn't try to stop it or make things better. It just let them all die. So many queer people died that there are barely any survivors. History only survives if there's people alive to tell those stories. But with no one alive, history's forgotten. That's what happened to the queer community. No one survived to tell their stories, and all that was left behind was artifacts, like the Queen and Paris is Burning. Obviously, it would be an over-exaggeration to say it completely wiped out the gay population, but I don't think that its impact can be understated. A lot of queer media was made during the 80s and before that, not just documentaries like Paris is Burning and the amazing yet utterly heartbreaking Silver Lake Life, but also films like Parting Glances and stage plays like March of the Falsettos. These were created during the 80s and heavily focused on being queer and on AIDS. There are pieces of media that exist that document the history of the queer community throughout this time period, but they're few and far between. These are products of their time and are proof that the queer community has a strong history and culture. Yet still, people seem to believe that the emergence of queer culture is a recent development.
I'm a man? How do you know I'm a man?
How do I know you're a man?
How do you know I'm a man?
Because I'm not in your era. I'm in my era. My era taught me that you were a man, regardless of what the you think you are.
But wait,
how do you about your feelings?
How do you know?
I'm telling you, I know. I was born in the 80s.
Because you're born in the 80s?
Imagination. Because I don't believe in your imagination. That's it.
Because you're born in the 80s.
Because I don't believe in your imagination.
Are they stupid? Yes, but that's besides the point. But you know what the saddest thing is? It's not just ignorance. It's willful ignorance. These people think this way because it fits their agenda. Their hatred of the queer community is strong. It's the same reason the US government didn't do anything when AIDS threatened to wipe out our population. They wanted it to happen. They want to believe that queer culture is this new thing, that it's just those crazy young kids going through a phase. They want it to be true because it'll fit their worldview. They'll pretend it's just a fad. A fad? Really? Over 100 years of history. That's a pretty long fad, guys. They're so scared of queer culture that they will lie, rewrite history, and attempt to genocide through inaction, just to satisfy their prejudiced beliefs. And they're still doing it. They vilify queer people, call them pedophiles and predators. Drag queens aren't even allowed to be around children in some places, despite the fact that only 40 years ago, Pepper LaBeija was doing a better job taking care of young people than any straight man could ever dream of doing. And one of the worst ones to me is this idea that young queer people are just confused and don't know who they are. They genuinely believe that young queer people don't exist, that they're just kids going through a phase, which is just ridiculous. Paris is Burning features two young black gay boys who are 15 and 13 years old. 15 and 13. And they weren't just confused young men going through a phase. These boys knew exactly who they were. Watching those two boys get interviewed for the first time genuinely changed my life. And you know what? I'm ashamed to say that I was once part of this problem. Before I understood who I was, I heard a lot of arguments that fill me with dread now and nodded along to it. I used to say to people during political discussion, well, these ideas are really new. We're still figuring out how to deal with them, which is just... ugh. If I could go back in time and punch young Jordan, I would. Then I would give him a hug and tell him to get his shit together. He might have a heart attack if he found out that he likes to kiss boys, though, but just... that kid needed some help, man. I said those things because those in positions of authority and on the internet told me, and I was a dumb teenager who listened. This still happens. There are people out there who hear this and completely disregard the history of queer culture. And Paris is Burning and the Queen are proof. Documented proof. Right there. The Queen came out in 1968. 1968, for crying out loud. And I think that's the thing. These products, Paris is Burning or Parting Glances, they were made specifically for and by the queer community to say, hey, look, we're here. We are valid. We are real. And I think that's what we're missing a lot of the time. We need to make media now to tell those stories, whether they're fictional or non-fictional. There are some things out there that are doing this work, such as Pose, which is honestly a great show to follow up Paris is Burning. But we as queer people and as media makers of tomorrow have a responsibility to know our history and to share it. Tear out the pages of those revised history books. Write new ones that tell the truth. Revive those old queens and their glamour and let them walk the ball floor one more time. Write it in books, show it in films, and shout it from the rooftops. We are real, and we are here. We've always been here, and we always will be. I'm Jordan Basement Boy Stevens. Thanks for watching.
This is New York City, and this is what the gay life is about. Right?